those things for accessibility did have a cost involved, but we had to sort of stick to our guns. And it's not so obvious. It's not as lovely as having some beautiful finish, for example, but it was important, and that was what was in our brief.
Well, Jan and Landon, I'm so excited to have you back here and updating us on your project on the podcast. It's going to be super exciting to understand what's going on, where you're at, and anything that you've been particularly navigating since the time that we last caught up. I'm wondering if you can just share with us to kick off, where are you at now in your project journey? What's kind of happening at the moment? What are you navigating? What are you dealing with in terms of your project process overall?
Well, where we're up to in the project is that we've got the footings and the block work done for the back part of our house. Maybe I should just explain that we have two buildings in this project. So it's a long, thin battle axe block, and the granny flat studio and carport building is at the top of the block. So as you come down the driveway, that's sort of what you see, and you drive into the carport in that building. And the house is a little further down the block. And so the part that's been done at the moment has been the earthworks for the lower part of the block that needs block work to get the slab up to the right level. So we've finished that part, and the next part will be whatever's needed for the footings, so for both the granny flat building and the first part of the house, so that all the slabs can go down at the same time. So that's where we're up to.
Oh, that's so exciting. So you've obviously got a lot to update us on then in terms of when we last chatted and where you're at now. So this is going to be a really fantastic conversation. So, and so if you can just talk a little bit more about, obviously, I'd be curious to understand how the design process has gone to kind of get you from where our last conversation was, where you were obviously formulating what the floor plan was going to look like. We had a lengthy conversation about what methodology of construction to choose for the granny flat, whether to buy something sort of off the shelf or to design it in keeping and construct it in keeping with the passive house style of the home that you were building. How has that design process kind of developed to get you to this point to be starting on site?
Well, I think we decided that if we got something from a different source, it would look like a pimple on a pumpkin or something like that, or could look like it.
Yes.
And so and also that although it might seem cheaper at the time, that the additional works associated with it may, sort of blow out that cost. So we ended up going with the architect designing an addition, a different way of doing it, and the builder building it. Also in, according to, in the same process as the passive house, but we're not going to have it certified as passive house, just because it seems to be redundant to do that.
So after we spoke to you when we did our last podcast recording, I noted in our diary that we had, in that same afternoon, rung the architect and discussed this whole granny flat thing. And both she and the builder were both, quite clear about the issues that were involved. And she, as Landon said, was very worried that it would look different and that wouldn't tie in with something that was going to look rather lovely. And the other thing was, and the builder was most keen on explaining this, that everything we saw had thermal, there were no thermal bridges. I mean, was it? Yes.
There were
thermal bridges, and And so, you know, that we were going to have not the same level of comfort in that building. And there is a chance that one day one or both of us might end up in that place. So it didn't make sense. So that's the way we've gone.
Awesome. And the house itself, how have you found that design process has gone to get you through to construction? Has that been fairly straightforward for you in terms of locking in the floor plan and navigating all of that design process with your architect?
Well, it's had many iterations. I think the one that we sort of normally look at is number 9, but since then there's been about 6 more.
Yeah, little variations. Yeah.
And it started off, like Jane says, the block is very long and thin. It's actually a normal sized block, but because it is very long, it looks thin. The process has been great, actually. So it started off being a very long house, and we've sort of brought it back a little bit.
And I think
together.
I think the fact that it's a passive house, we probably might talk about it a bit later, but it does have some restrictions on design. Unless you want to spend a lot of money, you can do anything with passive house if you want to spend the money. But we had a budget, so it's been a process, and I think it's been fine. Yep, it's been fine.
Should we talk through some of that stuff now, actually? Because I think that understanding, the tricky thing, well, not the tricky thing, but one of the, I often hear that the simplest passive house to build is kind of like the rectangular prism. The less turns and twists that you have in a passive home, the less you have to be super detailed about managing thermal breaks and all of those, management of the building envelope. And as you say, you can have anything in a passive house outcome. It's really just a case of what budget you've got. I know that when we first spoke about passive house on the podcast, it was, a few years ago, and we were talking about the Owlwoods passive house, and it's a passive house that Talina Edwards did that has got a lot of projections and a very interesting kind of building form, but then certain things came with that in terms of making that building form a passive house certified home. You've obviously taken the approach that you wanted to keep the design simple, and I know too that you also had some other goals in terms of accessibility, making sure that this is something that you guys can age really well in place, that it's going to suit you, kind of whatever your physical abilities might be. We've had conversations in the Home Method group where you've been chatting about the standard of livable housing guideline, kind of what standard you were going to build to with that. And I think your architect was initially looking at silver, and you were seeing where did you need to upgrade that from a design point of view, and asking other homies about widths of hallways and how they might have designed bathrooms. Can you talk through sort of some of that? It might obviously be in a distant memory now, given that you're starting on site, but I'm curious sort of thinking about navigating that through the iterations and staying. I know working with clients, what can be tricky is keeping people on track with that simple form, because you can find that very quickly you go, oh, let's just push this bit out here because we might get that, and we'll just expand this, and the next thing you know, you've stepped the building envelope all over the place. So keeping it to that kind of simple pavilion form whilst navigating all of those other things. What have you seen sort of play out in that design process for yourself?
Well, we did push something out in terms of our bedroom, and we also had to negotiate with the architect about the width of the hall. And of course, every time we pushed the hall width out, which meant the bedroom beside it became smaller. So then we had to push that out. So those things for accessibility did have a cost involved, but we had to sort of stick to our guns, so we mightn't have the 1.2, what is it, 0.2 wide hallway.
1.1.
I think we're 1.1. The bathrooms, both of them, are probably, well, certainly the ensuite is bigger than what would be normally. okay, because we needed to have room for whatever might possibly come in the future. So those things have a cost, which, you know, aren't, and it's not so obvious. It's not as lovely as having some beautiful finish, for example, but it was important, and that was what was in our brief. And so, and in fact, we did have to say to the architect, we had to remind her about it. We chose not to have a two-storey house. I mean, I'd love to have a two-storey house. This old house that we're in is two-storey. We're just next door to our building site. And the stairs are really steep and so on, but I love being upstairs because you get lots of sun and so on. But we didn't want to build something that at some point in our future we mightn't be able to access part of the house. So, you know, we've made choices. And I think the architect, to her credit, you know, she was saying, but you're so fit and healthy, and we are, and going up and down stairs is good for you, and it is, but we also know you only need to have a fall and then you can't access that part of the house. She had a fall, by the way, and I think it sort of gave her an insight. That sounds incredibly condescending, and we love our architect, but it just, I think, she said, I think we might put a handrail, on our little outside deck, which is, doesn't quite need it in terms of its height, but yes, we'll have a handrail. So all those things have been interesting to negotiate, and I did send a text to her yesterday just to say, did you remember to put in the, in the construction drawings about having the potential for adding handrails and things in the bathroom? We don't want them now, but we want to be able to do it. And she said, yes, she's done it. So, yeah, we're on our way.
And as it is, there are steps down the back. The block we're on slopes very slightly, and so there's steps at the back and steps at the side garden, and also there's a couple of steps up to the granny flat level, but you can also access that through the garden, on a sort of a more rampy type of way.
And we can get out of the carport, out of our car and into the house without a step. So, those things, we've got the, we'll be okay should we become frail and incapacitated. Not a plan, but just in case. We don't.
Can you remind me what's actually in the main house and what's in the granny flat in terms of the overall layout?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the house we have 2 bedrooms. Our main bedroom with a walk-in wardrobe and an ensuite, and a spare bedroom which is quite smallish, and we have a room we call the multi-purpose room, and it is multi-purpose. I think of it as my study. It's also going to have a sofa bed, and it'll become a third, overflow bedroom at some point if we need it. And it's also a bit of a music room, so it's got our piano. It's quite biggish. So we've got that, and then we've got a kitchen, lounge room, dining room in an L shape, and all of that is sort of like an E-shaped, not an E-shaped, a C-shape around an outdoor room. So that's where we had the extra corners. We just needed it. We wanted to have an outdoor room, so our lounge room and dining room and our kitchen and our bedroom all, enclosed that little outdoor area.
Lovely. And then what's in the granny flat?
The granny flat has 1 bedroom. It's only 42 square metres. It's only small, but it does have, had to have, which I was, didn't want, but it had to have a little laundry, which seemed ridiculous. But anyway, it's got a little bathroom, minuscule laundry, a bedroom, and a a lounge kitchen open area, and it leads out onto a bit of a terrace, a little terrace where we can have outdoor chair table.
Terrace on the north side.
So it'll be lovely. It'll be very nice. Yeah.
And it sounds like the main house is doing a really lovely job of maintaining that indoor-outdoor connection from so many different areas within it, which is going to be a great way to experience that site as well. So
we hope so. And there is also at the back a deck that actually connects up to the outdoor area, around the corner, and that won't have a roof, but it will have a pergola and vines and things. So we're hoping it's going to be okay. We think it will be. We can imagine it, but you never know till you see it,
Well, what I love about this process and what I see time and time again is because of the preparation and the learning that you've done and how you've implemented that in the selection of your team and then working with your team proactively, and all of the questions that you're asking along the way and all of the intentional thinking that you're doing along the way. The joy of this is that when the home is finished, it actually exceeds your expectations. So it's this thing of, we knew what it looked like, but we didn't expect it to look this good or feel this good. So I have an inkling that that's actually what's going to be the outcome.
I hope so. I mean, our daughter was here not very long ago, just this week, and she had a look at our, the work that's happened, and she said, just be prepared that first of all you're going to think it's not big enough, and then they'll put the slab in, and you think, my goodness, that's huge. And then the walls will go up and you'll think, oh, my God, those rooms are tiny. And she said then they'll do all the plaster work and painting and you'll think it's enormous again. So I thought that was very helpful. She's just been through it with a renovation, you see.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, it's very true. It always looks the sizes are strangely deceptive as it's moving through its different stages of construction. So
we're pre-warned.
Fantastic. And so you've talked a bit about your budget and working to maintain your budget. How tricky has that been through the process of design? And I suppose working with your builder to have that input and that knowledge as you navigate the design process and, testing against the passive house requirements. What's that look like, your management of your budget through all of this?
Well, it sort of got a bit confusing, when you get into there are so many things happening, so many, we're paying out for the, for all the
arborists
and all those things.
Surveyors and
all those people. And then at the same time, we're trying to work out how much it's going to cost. And the builder did a preliminary estimate, which we actually found really useful when we did things like do our selections, because we kept things within, what his budget was, which was a great help when we went to do things like buy tiles, because you go into those showrooms with the most beautiful, beautiful tiles, and you just don't know where to begin. But if you go up to somebody and say, we're looking for tiles in this price range, instantly you go, this is what you've got. Which is fine because they're lovely too, but it just, took away all that extraneous looking and made our decision easier. So it was really helpful for us, even though that was only an estimate. All the way along, the architect and the builder have communicated with each other and us about costs, and always the architect consults with the builder when she's made a change or thinking about something. She'll check with Darren the builder and say, I'm going to do this, has it got a cost implication? And he'll say, yep, it has, we could do it this way, and they'll talk about it. And so this dialogue has been happening constantly all the way along, and with us. And of course, we've had to make choices and compromises or stick to our guns, in different situations. And that's been an interesting process. And I really like the way the builder says, I will say it as I see it. And if I think it's going to be really expensive, or if I think it's not going to work in our system of making the panels, because it's all been made in a factory.
So some of the things like with the choice of windows and doors, that was interesting. It's a big saga. Getting the sizes right and reviewing the schedules to make sure that what we are expecting was actually written down there for the manufacturer. But we started off with an idea about what we wanted for, the door to be, or the front door to be. And it was we spent hours and hours trying to get the right colour, and then
the cost had to, it blew out. So suddenly we're on a different trajectory in terms of trying to choose things. So it's been constant, always, making decisions.
But in the end, we were confronted with, it's going to be this much cost, and we chose the cheaper option, and I think that's made us happier. There's lots and lots of things that we had to consider, and everything seemed to happen all at once. Like we had to have our decisions about bathroom and kitchenware sorted by the end of the week, and we'd been looking around at things, but thinking that we'd had, lots and lots of time to go through it. But anyway, so we ended up, being forced into it, and did our choices and made our orders and things like that. So everything's basically ordered, kitchenware and, appliances and things like that. So
it's music to my ears, Jan and Landon, because it sounds to me you're doing the fact that there's basically retaining going in on site, and still earthworks happening, and yet you've got these decisions locked away, to me shows that you're working through a really methodical process, and you're working with a team who is supporting you in working through that methodical process, because there are stories of builders calling a client literally a week before, having never discussed it with them before, and then saying a week out, oh, look, we need all of your tapware on site next week. Go to this showroom and make all of your selections because we need them. Whereas you've obviously had the preliminary estimate, so you've kind of known the ballpark of what you're working in. You've then been able to kind of filter through your selections. And so even though you've been, I suppose, had this deadline presented to you, there's been a bunch of pre-thinking that's happened so that it's not all happening, in that kind of very short time frame. And so I love how you've been shepherded through this, and that comment about it really excites me that your designer, your architect, and your builder are working so collaboratively together, because that's when you start to get the best out of the process. That kind of collegiate, sharing of information, and the fact that they've been also communicating with you so proactively, that to me is a project well done. And so it's really exciting to hear that that's been your experience of it.
I would just.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Jan, for the uninitiated, this is a lot.
Yes.
It's a lot.
Oh, good. Yes, it is. It is a lot. And I was just going to say an example of how this process has worked. The builder took the design for the kitchen or for all the cabinetry, and gave it to the person he uses for cabinet making for a price. And it came back hugely over what he had estimated, like 60,000 over. So we had this sort of really honest conversation. Oh dear. Anyway, we did this on Zoom only, a week ago. And so he said, now, this is how much the granny flat kitchen is costing. And he said, I think it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous for a granny flat kitchen. What are we going to change? So we all talked about what we could change. We did it the same in the kitchen. Okay, this is, I thought it wasn't a bad price for a kitchen, but, he said, because you're so over in the cost of this kitchen, what can we change? And so I said, well, we can take all those bifold doors, that you lift up. I didn't care, it wasn't a big importance to me, but there were things that I wanted to keep, so we, for example, in the granny flat, tiny little bathroom, but it's got it's the cisterns inbuilt. I've forgotten.
Oh, the concealed cisterns? Yeah.
Concealed. And he said, well, that's expensive.
Yeah.
And the architect and I both said, no, we're keeping it. That was non-negotiable. So that's how.
Especially since we'd already bought it.
Oh, yes.
But it sounds like it's been enabling you. I mean, this is the thing, and it's what I talk to architects and builders about. It's not their job to figure out what is expensive or cost effective for you. It's their job to educate you about what your decisions are costing, so that then you can make those value-based choices that are aligned with your priorities and your goals and where you want to see your money go.
Yes. So it's been good, and I appreciate his honesty, and I also appreciate his saying, okay, I understand that's important. So, so in the end, we're not going to save as much as we hoped, but we're going to save some. The other thing was the architect had designed some really lovely raised garden beds around the edge of our back deck and around the side as it leads towards the covered area, and it would have looked lovely. And it was going to cost $20,000 at least for some reason, and everything costs more than you ever imagine. And so the builder said, I know what we can do, because, the other thing is that it had to be engineered, with all that soil and, the height and so on. He said, we could have those blocks that you stack. And we thought, don't like it. I could see the architect wasn't that keen. And we sort of mulled it over for a while. And in the end, yesterday I just said, I'd rather not have it now, to have something like that. It's just going to look really not the best. I'd rather wait or not have it at all than have it look daggy, which I thought it was going to look daggy. So, they're the things, we seem to be making lots of decisions and then we move on and we forget, this process of getting ready for this podcast, we've both sat and talked and read our notes and answered the questions on writing pads and all that stuff just to get our head around it. And we just realised how much we've done and the decisions we've made and more decisions that we've made. And it just goes on for months and months and you forget. A bit like childbirth in a way.
It's very much like childbirth.
all of a sudden, we're at this point and you forget what's happened,
Yeah. And just the remarkable amount that you've been able to do and make decisions about, having never done this before. Like, it's total kudos to you that, I know that you say, oh, it's been a lot and it's been, there's been a lot of it. But I hope that in that reflection, you can also be super proud of yourselves in terms of what you've been able to accomplish to get to this point, and how well that set you up for what's going to be happening, coming forward. So it's, it is. And this is, it's why we talk about in Home Method. It's really important that you keep a paper trail. I know that you guys have got this beautiful red book that you note everything in. Just at the beginning of this, Landon started writing down the date like he needs to take notes from this podcast episode as well. Like, you've got a practice in place that makes you really good project managers and means that you've always got this kind of documentation to go back to, because you don't remember everything.
No.
And things that feel very intense in the moment and very like impactful and like life or death almost,
Yes.
30 days, 60 days later, they're like a blip on your radar. So it's, it's such a fascinating process. So it's really awesome to hear you share that. And I think what I hear from what you're saying is, you know, things like the garden beds as an example. I love that you're not going, look, let's just figure out how we can dummy it up and make a cheaper version. You're actually going back to the core of what are we seeking to achieve here? This isn't going to do the job. We don't want a poor cousin of what we were seeking to achieve. We'd rather just not have it at all and have a better outcome, rather than trying to sort of dolly it up with something that's cheaper. So, and I think then when you are making choices to choose, like you were talking about, Landon, with the lower cost windows and doors, you know, it's then you're still making those value-based choices from a really intentional place of where you're going to spend less money versus spend more money, and, you know, that kind of stuff. The bifold doors in the kitchen, you know, all of that kind of thing. It sounds to me like you're doing all the right things in terms of how you're making those choices with clarity and with confidence. So I absolutely love, you know, that update.
I don't know about confidence always. I think you're over egging the pudding here.
I think you need to give yourself more credit.
We don't feel confident, but, you know, we muddle along. You know, we you know, the first time we've ever done it. So yes, confidence. Sometimes we are, but we do have the team. You know, we do have the architect and the builder that we can talk to. So that does help.
And it's sort of like the juggernaut. You know, once you start it rolling, it just
goes,
takes you along with it, and you know, you do what you do, what you can to stay on board, and but like it's just going to keep going, isn't it? Until it stops.
It does. It does. Alrighty. And has there been, I suppose, you know, you've talked about a couple of kind of hiccups or hurdles, or has there sort of been anything that's sort of stood out where you've been pleasantly surprised, or, you know, you might have a niggling feeling of, oh gosh, did we make the right choice there? Like, has anything like that come up for you as you've been navigating it overall?
I want to talk about the workers so far. This is a pleasant surprise, not a surprise. Well, I was trying to think what's been a pleasant surprise, and we both agreed that the quality of the work we've seen and the quality of, you know, the workers has been fantastic. Really, I mean, we've seen a lot of building sites, you know, around us, both where we were living before and now, and often things you sort of think, my goodness, it seems slapdash. You know, we suddenly find ourselves being old people saying it wasn't like that in our day, you know, that sort of stuff. Well, not entirely, but you can just see that things aren't done well, and the houses you end up seeing look a bit shoddy. And so who we've had here, the workers we've had here, has been the fellow with the excavator, and the concreters and the people who do the block work. And they've been so meticulous and so polite and friendly. I mean, we've got a bird's eye view. It's better than television. We can look out our windows and watch our house being done. And we just marvel at how, I think they're proud of what they do. So I think the builder has chosen some very good subcontractors, and he's got an excellent site manager or building supervisor, whatever you call him. And he keeps a good eye on what's happening, and we see him quite a lot, when things are on. So that's been, you sort of hope for it, and so a surprise is probably not the right word, but we're really pleased that this is what we're seeing. It makes us feel like we've chosen well, I guess.
And you mentioned the house is obviously being built from prefab panels.
Yeah.
So have the panels already started construction? What's the process with that?
Well, they're in discussion about this because the windows aren't going to arrive from Germany until about October. And normally they wait for that to happen and then they build the panels around them. But because of this, sort of time lag, they're thinking that they might build the panels and then put the windows in. So this
like
is
on site.
Yeah, or some of them. So this is a discussion that's ongoing with Mark, the supervisor, and the builder, and probably the architect. So we're not quite sure where that is, but we won't be in till, I don't know, March or April.
After Christmas.
Yeah, well after Christmas. We're not even imagining Christmas.
Yeah, more like
Any
Easter, hey?
And you had a question about hurdles and things, and there were goes in terms of pricing again. When they built the trenches for this first part of the work, the structural engineer came and did an inspection, and he thought, this happened while we were in New Zealand, by the way. We've just come back from 2 weeks in New Zealand, and while he thought the soil was softer than he'd imagined, for the design, and he thought we'll have to put piers down or make, so he and the builder had a discussion, and it was decided that the trenches would be made wider in some places, and that cost us an extra $7,000 for the work and for the extra concrete. So that was one.
But it probably saved us
that would have been considerably less though than peering. So
that
sounds like it was a really great collaboration between the builder and the structural engineer to resolve it in a way that was going to meet the engineer's requirements but not blow out your budget considerably by having to stop everything and start peering. Yeah.
So that's happened. The concreters said with these footings you could put a 3-story building on it, or apartment. I don't know how much they know, but anyway, we've got that.
The structural engineer is the one who has to insure it, though. So, so the concreter can say that, but it's not their insurance that covers it.
No. Anyway, they were impressed.
Yeah. And it sounds like all of your team's working together really well, as you mentioned, and that your role in it is really clear. And, have you felt like that in terms of, you've talked about, messaging the architect and saying, have you remembered this? Like, do you feel really supported in terms of how you're navigating this, and you've got these people in your corner keeping you informed? And
oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. That's right. It's you won't remember, but when we first had made the selection of the architect and the builder, instead of interviewing lots of architects or
I remember you just got to meet her, and then that was it, wasn't it?
We met her and then made that decision, and then she worked with this builder, and suddenly there we were. And I sort of, every now and then, not because of anything they did, I just wondered, should I have done more? But really, our decision was the right decision for us. For us, it's been fantastic. I think, we, feel very supported in what we're doing.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic.
We're a bit in the dark, and after listening to your last podcast about the drama triangles, I think we realised that we in fact need to go back and say, can we have this explained even more clearly?
Be the creator, not the victim, yeah?
Yes.